Most people are making the wrong trades heading into their deadline. They're chasing names that peaked in September and ignoring players whose value is exploding for the fantasy playoffs. That's how you fall behind fast. So in this video, I'm going to show you the week 12 trade targets that you need to buy right now. Let's fly through the news today. Joe Burrow practicing fully for week 12 against the Patriots. This was great to see. Obviously, we kind of expected it to be maybe week 13 against the Ravens, that divisional opponent, but step in the right direction. We'll be monitoring this toe injury and how his practice reports look throughout the week. Jackson Dart, another one that we're kind of monitoring, obviously that concussion injury. He was still in a non-contact jersey though, but the participation in general, really strong sign. We'll get Jackson Dart hopefully back this week and give the Giants just a boost overall. Darius Slayton, another one that we're watching on the Giants, that hamstring injury. He did not practice on Wednesday though, so he most likely won't be out there for week 12, even if Jackson Dart is back. DeAndre Swift, hip injury limited in Wednesday's practice. He did miss one game for that hip injury a few weeks ago, but playing through it, so it looks like he's going to continue to do that. Aaron Rodgers does have that wrist injury, did not practice on Wednesday. It doesn't look like this is going to be like a long-term thing, so I'm not, alarmed by it so far, but a wrist fracture on the non-throwing left arm could keep him sidelined this week, so we'll keep an eye on that. Stephon Diggs, in terms of fractures, he did fracture a finger a couple weeks ago as well, so that was a surprise to me. He's looked great as they've continued to kind of scale him up to being a full-time participant in these games. So Stephon Diggs, kind of sneaky from a volume perspective down the stretch, I think. Rashad Bateman, that ankle injury, did not practice on Wednesday. That injury was back in week 10, so we'll see if he can get back sooner rather than later, but this looks like he might miss at least one more week. Isaiah Pacheco did practice on Wednesday, so we'll see. He's still kind of progressing. He hasn't been out there since week 8, but does seem to be nearing a return, so that would obviously affect people like Kareem Hunt, Rashard Smith, all of those things. So we'll keep an eye on the KC backfield. Drake London. This one was, hopeful, that Drake London can return in week 13. They've already said that he's out in week 12 against the Saints, but it is one of those ones that with Michael Penix now done for the season, they really need to get Drake London back on the field. The last time we saw Kirk Cousins, they had no Drake London and just Darnell Mooney out there, Kyle Pitts, and not great. So hopefully we can get him back so that Cousins, we can get a real sample there. This one was great. Trey Benson, we finally have some Trey Benson news. The Cardinals opened the 21-day practice window for him. Honestly, this backfield has been pretty terrible since he's been gone. So this would be really exciting for the fantasy playoffs if you were able to stash him. With the trade deadline looming in most fantasy leagues around Thanksgiving, this is an important week from a trade perspective, rest of season. So spent a little bit of extra time on the rest of season rankings this week, but wanted to touch on a few questions from a video earlier this week. Should I trade away T. Higgins and Aaron Jones for James Cook? I prefer T. Higgins and Aaron Jones. James Cook, I definitely have up there, but he's someone that down the stretch, especially if you're on a winning team and you don't need to unload some depth, I think that you, in theory, will be running into some of the worst matchups possible in the fantasy playoffs. I think he's one of those guys that actually makes a reasonable sell. So I would prefer T. Higgins and Aaron Jones if you could use two starters personally. Traded Odunze and Sutton for Jefferson. I think that's a pretty good one. Jefferson's one of those guys, we'll talk about him a little bit more later in this video, that I would be actively trying to acquire, but that's a haul. Rome Odunze and Cortland Sutton for him. So again, I think if you're really needing wide receiver depth, that might look a little bit better for having Odunze and the Sutton side. But if you're just trying to upgrade and you have the ability to kind of take a shot on Jefferson, he's one of those risks I think that's worth taking. I made a trade. I get Chase Brown and Waddle. He gets Jefferson, Juwan Jennings, and Pollard. Yeah, I like the Jefferson side of this one. I like Jaylen Waddle quite a bit. Chase Brown, I think, is someone that has seen his ranking go up over the last couple of weeks, rest of season for me. But Justin Jefferson, Jennings, and Pollard. Pollard is just kind of a throw in there, but Jennings and Jefferson, I think that both of those guys really solid values. It's close, but I think I would prefer the Jefferson side as he's the best player in this deal. Odunze or Olave. This one's like right next to each other in my rest of season rankings. I do have Chris Olave one slot ahead of Rome Odunze, so it's kind of a coin flip. Obviously, Rome Odunze had a really hot start. Chris Olave in that target share not going anywhere, but both on teams that have struggled to move the football recently through the air. Just traded away Jaylen Waddle for Justin Jefferson. Yeah, I like that. Like I said, I have Jefferson ahead of Waddle, but it is relatively close rest of season. I have Cook and Bowers. Package them to get who? This was a tough one. Cook and Bowers together, I think you're probably looking at some sort of 2v2. somewhat lateral, I probably wouldn't be trading Cook and Bowers for maybe anyone outside of like the top 3 overall. So that was a tough one. Who should I get if I trade away ETN? Yeah, so the guys that I would be targeting ahead of ETN in my rest of season, I would go after guys like Quentin Johnston, Alec Pierce. I think you can get kind of like a mid-range wide receiver like that. Maybe a guy like Kenneth Walker, who there's some reports that he's going to get more work down the stretch. I like that quite a bit. Again, then Trey Benson, like I mentioned before, I think he makes a really solid bet down the stretch. I have him kind of in that same tier of Aaron Jones, if that gives you any direction. But yeah, I would prefer all of those guys over Travis Etienne rest of season. Should I trade away BTJ, Zach Charbonnet, and Jordan Addison for Aaron Jones? Let's see. BTJ, Zach Charbonnet, so it's Charbonnet or Jordan Addison. Yeah, I would do that. I would have Aaron Jones ahead of the Thomas Jr. and Charbonnet combination. Yeah, I think I would do that. I think I would. All right, what else we got? Cook for who? Cook for who? Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of players right above James Cook, obviously, right? He's had a great season, just really tough matchups down the stretch. So if you're not comfortable moving him, I totally get it. But if I could trade him 1-for-1 for Derrick Henry, I think I would. I think I would trade him 1-for-1 for like Amon-Ra St. Brown, Rashee Rice, those type of players. So those would be the ones that I think that you could kind of attack if you did want to unload Cook. I don't think you're going to get into that Puka Nacua, Jamar Chase tier, but you might be able to get Rashee Rice for him. Derrick Henry, that tier. Good luck. I traded Drake London for Jamar Chase. Did I win? I have Jamar Chase significantly ahead of Drake London rest of season with that injury. So yes, I would be on the Chase side. Who do I trade Marvin Harrison Jr. for? Yeah, this one again, the guys ahead that I would prefer. I like Jaylen Waddle. I like guys like Rico Dowdle ahead of him, Javonte Williams. I don't know if you can get any of those guys from Marvin Harrison Jr., but I would have them right above him in my rest of season rankings. If you wanted to package another piece for one of those guys I mentioned, or even get into like that George Pickens tier, that would be pretty solid. Zay Flowers, all of those guys I would prefer to Marvin Harrison the rest of the way. All right, today's one key topic, 10 players about to explode in fantasy football for the fantasy football playoff specifically. If your trade deadline has not passed, these would be guys that I'd be actively trying to trade for before that deadline passes. So the first guy that we're going to talk about, he's on the thumbnail, Saquon Barkley. So he's had an interesting season, right? After where we drafted him, after what he did last year, all of those things. But when it comes down to it, he still had a really strong workload. He's only the RB11 on the season, third in opportunity share, fourth in carries, just 50th in points per opportunity. So he's still kind of stacking those 20 touch games like we want to see, but you really need that true RB1 usage the rest of the way. So I like the fantasy playoff run. Raiders, Commanders, Bills. That's the fourth most favorable running back schedule. So I really like that one quite a bit. I think that there's a nice redemption arc for Saquon if you can go out and get him. I think the inefficiency that he's shown this year is really just a nice buy low window. And he's only had two 20-plus yard runs all season after having 17 last year. So he's been, I guess, on the surface a little bit more of a grinder. This offensive line's had some injuries, but I think that there's some regression here on the positive side for some more big plays, especially with some of those matchups that he has coming up. And I think when Philly really turns it on, I think they still, when it comes down to it, want to be able to run the ball and run the ball effectively. So true league winning upside for Saquon Barkley if you can get him and pry him away from his current owner. Let's talk about Bucky Irving. This one's tough, right? Because we don't have a ton of word on his injury right now, but he already was that workhorse before the injury. So this one's a little bit of a leap of faith. The injury pause is kind of like a buying window to me. I don't think it's truly a red flag yet. He has been out for quite some time, but I do think that in general, this foot shoulder issue, the shoulder seems to be behind him in some of those notes that they've given us so far, but the foot is still causing him some issues. So if he can return healthy, by the time the fantasy playoffs roll around, he's got one of the best schedules in the entire league, the second best running back schedule, weeks 15 through 17 against the Falcons, Panthers, and Dolphins. So from a matchup perspective, it really doesn't get much better than that. So he's one of those guys that I'm actively trying to acquire on teams that have a chance to have a really deep playoff run. Aaron Jones. So This is one of those guys where the workhorse role has been pretty locked in over the last couple weeks. He was hurt for a good chunk of the season, but they've kind of moved on already from Jordan Mason. This offense has been pretty broken with JJ McCarthy, but if he can improve at all, and obviously the matchups get better and they get better quickly, I think there's some reasons to be optimistic about Minnesota. And I think this schedule is just too nice. Cowboys and Giants in the fantasy playoffs. So a guy like Aaron Jones who can make big plays, but also be active in the passing game and on the ground. Super intriguing from an upside perspective. Devon Achane. So if we're working through like some of the injury stuff, I still think there's a chance that he could still be like the bell cow down the road or down the fantasy playoffs. 21, 22 carries weeks 10 and 11. The first time in his entire career he's seen 20 plus carries in back-to-back games. So he turned that into 294 rushing yards, also 96 receiving on 11 catches over those 2 weeks. So really nice to see a guy like this getting the workload. And obviously, I don't think his coach is going to be going anywhere, which was a little bit of a concern earlier this year. They've been winning a few games, so I think all is safe, and he's going to continue to get peppered with the receiving role that he has in addition to what he's been getting on the ground. He's kind of game script proof at this point, and the Dolphins' offense is a little bit scary in general, but I think that once this role kind of hits the playoffs, it does get a little bit better as well. 8th best matchup stretch over the fantasy playoffs: Steelers, Bengals, and Bucks. So really like that one quite a bit. I think he's firmly entrenched already as like an RB1 in most people's eyes, but you might be able to acquire him for the right price, and that's one that I would be making some concessions, package deals to try and acquire. TreVeyon Henderson. I hope you have him. We talked about him all offseason. We talked about him a lot as someone to acquire in this exact video, actually, multiple times this season. Explosive feature back that has truly emerged in New England. So over the last 3 games, he's seen at least 15 touches every week. 24 in week 11. He handled 19 of 22 running back carries, added 5 targets. So that's the kind of locked in volume that you trade for this time of the year if you don't have him. He scored 5 times over the last 2 weeks. That will come down, obviously, but he's playing on a good team and having a lot of success and breaking some big plays, scoring touchdowns, everything you want from a fantasy perspective as well. And he has that speed that you can really just win an entire week on a few of his big plays. So the schedule is about to get even better. Week 17, third easiest, or weeks 15 through 17, third easiest running back schedule. So you're really buying an ascending back right as his calendar kind of turns in his favor. Bills, Ravens, and Jets. So like that one quite a bit from a matchup perspective. I think this is probably your last spot or last shot to get him. And yeah, the toe injury, a little bit concerning for Stevenson still. So if Henderson continues to dominate snaps and touches, like I think he will, he's going to be a big part of championship teams. So we got 5 running backs so far. We're going to talk about 5 wide receivers: TreVeyon Henderson, Devon Achane, Aaron Jones, Bucky, Irving, Saquon, Barkley. Obviously, these are guys that you're going to have to give up a lot for, but I think it might be worth it. From a wide receiver perspective, let's talk about Jaylen Waddle. Jaylen Waddle, wide receiver 1 volume without Tyreek so far in those weeks since Tyreek has been out. In week 11, he led Miami in receiving with just 52 yards, but it was a 35% target share. And he's one of those guys that Tua can kind of lock into. Pretty brutal, like I guess, floor that he's shown over the last little while, but it does get a little bit better from a matchup perspective. This offense has been just kind of messy outside of Achane at times, but the playoff schedule is really nice. Weeks 15 through 17, the Dolphins at the 5th easiest quarterback schedule, 4th easiest wide receiver schedule. So that wide receiver 1 usage lines up with a really solid playoff runway. So we get defenses like the Steelers, who have given up the second most fantasy points to wide receivers. We get the Bengals and we get the Bucks, who have been kind of dominated by everyone. So really like that. He's a locked-in wide receiver 1 from a volume perspective. He gets a top 4 playoff schedule. I don't think that he's someone we should be ignoring as we pass the trade window. Another guy, all offseason we talked about him. And then most of this season, he was a buy low for us. Finally getting his upside turned back on, essentially, with Jameson Williams. Dan Campbell basically has turned JMO back into a weekly weapon. Since he started calling plays, Williams has gone 6 for 119 and 1, 4 for 88 and 1. And in those 2 weeks, he's back into the fantasy relevant category, true game-breaking ceiling. In that Commanders win, he caught 5 of 5 targets for 105 yards and a touchdown in the third quarter alone. So really like this. Obviously, he's an elite deep threat, but they're also getting the ball into his hands on these kind of short to intermediate bursts. He's kind of got that boomer bust label, so he might still be someone that you can acquire without, like, I guess, breaking the bank too much. I think most people think that his floor is not as high as it actually is with what we've seen with these new play calling and with the new targets that he has been getting. So I think that he's kind of one of the biggest priorities. The explosive plays that he will potentially get. They get the Giants in week 12, but then also the Rams, Steelers, and Vikings in weeks 15 through 17, and a bunch of games indoors on the turf. So we like that for these explosive, quick weapons. Wan'Dale Robinson, a little bit of a different type of player that we'd be going after, but the volume like this is usually one that you can't trade for. And obviously with Neighbors out, that's been kind of the first read. And if we get Jackson Dart back, he does have the second easiest wide receiver playoff schedule. They get Washington, Minnesota, and Las Vegas in weeks 15 through 17. So we really like that. This target share is going to continue to be just an anchor in PPR leagues and someone that, again, I don't think is valued as high as he should be. Let's talk about A.J. Brown. Obviously, it's been a down year on paper, but he's still kind of an alpha in reality. So lowest yards per game of his standout career, even though the Eagles sit at 8-2. But his first 5 games, he had just one outing of over 43 receiving yards. He did have a couple really big games along the way. So when the Eagles kind of were forced to open it up, he had that 6 for 109 line against the Rams. He also had 121 yards and 2 touchdowns against the Vikings on just 6 targets. So the ceiling games are still in his bag. And if the owner is getting frustrated, I think that this is kind of like a fake bad situation. I think he's obviously been openly unhappy, complaining about his role, all of those things. But I think there's a chance still that he gets a little bit more volume down the stretch, and I'd be buying going into that stretch. So the wide receiver matchups down the road are pretty solid, and the market's still treating A.J. Brown like a disappointment after kind of this situation of him complaining, all of that. So I'm buying the talent and hoping that down the stretch he can have some big games. Justin Jefferson. Yeah. So basically kind of going from like a top 3 player to like a top 20 price tag is kind of where he's at right now. Over the past 9 games, he has just 1 touchdown, something closer to like a top 25 option at times. And if you can get him for that type of value, I would absolutely do that. Still led the Vikings with 9 targets. He did just go 5 for 61. So the role hasn't changed a ton. It's really just been JJ McCarthy and them not being able to get kind of on the same page. But JJ is someone that has survived bad quarterback play before. So I think if McCarthy can even show a few strides here over the next little bit, it's an amazing matchup down the stretch for the playoff schedule. They get the Cowboys, the Giants, and the Lions. It's the number 1 most favorable fantasy matchup schedule for the wide receiver stretch run. So it's a team, a player that we're betting on talent, obviously, but if things just get a little bit better, he has the matchups to go completely crazy. And I don't think that most people are valuing him with the ceiling that he still has in his bag with this situation, in the right matchups with the right opportunity.